Welcome, everybody, to the Timothy Kenny podcast. Today I'm here with Prerak Juthani, and we're talking about Anki, we're talking about accelerated learning, and we're talking about his experience in med school and also what he's on to next, which is a combined MD, MBA program at Yale. So we're going to be getting into all that. I really cut my teeth on Anki with Prerak's YouTube videos. He's got a huge collection of Anki videos on YouTube. When I was first getting involved in coaching some medical school students a couple years ago, I was looking into Anki and trying to really understand the whole, I see med school as sort of the Navy SEALs of accelerated learning, the most challenging environment where there's the most pressure to learn, where you really have to have efficiency. And so it was a really steep learning curve for me, and seeing how impactful, I mean, Anki is pretty much the secret weapon. If you boil it down in terms of medical school, it's the biggest game changer you can get. And we'll get more into that. But that I learned a lot of what I know about Anki through Prerak's videos. And I recommend you check him out on YouTube at Prerak Juthani. And so why don't we start out, Prerak? Just how about you tell us your story in med school, where you are right now, a little bit about this MBA thing that you're headed to next, and how you got involved with Anki.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm currently a third-year medical student, and so that means I've finished the hard stuff, which is what you were referring to. Like the first 2 years of medical school, everyone gives the metaphor is like drinking out of a fire hydrant because you could just have that much information. And so, as you mentioned, to go to that level of learning, even coming from undergrad, is a lot. And undergrad already as a science major can be like really, really tough in terms of memorization, but medical school takes it to a whole new level. And at that point, you really have to come up with different ways and different tools that will allow you to pretty much learn everything. And up till maybe even, I'd say 6-7 years ago, there was nothing, not that much. I'd say maybe Quizlet, maybe flashcards that people would make on their own. But I think when Anki came onto the floor, that's when the whole game changed. And even now, it's still in its infancy in terms of its development as a tool to learn. But I think in medical school is where it's getting the most attention, just because it's been able to accelerate the amount that we learn and make it manageable, which I don't think was ever really even possible in the past.
It seemed like a lot of people thought it was just foreign language learning vocab, and it was very like narrow application. That's what I think is so interesting about this medical school usage is it's really procedural knowledge, declarative knowledge. Like it's all put into Anki and it's used, and people are actually getting results with it. So maybe you can talk about those results people are getting, and like there's a lot on the line for medical school students, because if you want that, if you want your choice of residency, which is basically after, you can explain it better than me, but after med school, you do this like 3 to 7 year internship or something like that with at a hospital where you're sort of like a junior doctor or a starter doctor, and then you get your full license after that. And so if you want to get into the field of your choice, like you want to be a radiologist or a surgeon or a dermatologist, you need to get a certain grade to get into the most selective, desirable residencies or subdomains. So people have a huge incentive to memorize this stuff, to do well on this USMLE Step 1 test, which is like the big test after your 2 years. So can you talk just about all that stuff and like within the med school community, how do people, like, what are the actual results people are seeing with Anki?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're absolutely right. So the biggest reason why med students are motivated to learn what they want to learn is, one, to obviously help their future patients, but two, because we have to take a bunch of board exams, and the most important of which is currently the USMLE Step 1 that you just mentioned. So this test is pretty much a 8-hour test, consists of 280 questions, and that's broken down into 7 sections of 40 questions each that are each 1 hour long, and then you get a 1 hour break for lunch and whatnot. And basically this test is out of 300, but anything over 250 is pretty much the 90th percentile. So it just goes to show you how ridiculously difficult this test is. And I have taken it before. And I can tell you it's the hardest test I've ever taken in my life. So that kind of puts things into perspective, because we take a lot of tests, medical students, and for this to be the hardest one is saying a lot. And so because of that, there's a why exactly is it the hardest test? Well, it's the hardest test because it's literally everything and anything in medicine is fair game. It can ask you about anything biochemistry related. They can ask you about any organ system. They can ask you about any disease. They can ask you about any sort of ecological public health situation. Like anything and everything is fair game for this test. And that's what makes it such a like monumental task to overcome. And now if you want to get into the residency of your choice, well, that means that you have to somehow find a way to make this monumental task manageable.
Mhm.
And that's primarily where Anki comes in. And so Anki, as I said, is this massive flashcard app where a bunch of students can do all these flashcards related to all these diseases. And if you do them well enough, because of the spaced repetition learning algorithm and the fact that Anki helps you retain things over a long period of time, you will end up seeing pretty phenomenal results, right? So on YouTube right now, you'll see like there's pretty much a bunch of videos about people who have used Anki, and most every single one of those videos, including the one I've published, end up having results that show at least 90th percentile, if not higher. And these are all people who have taken the test, who will then discuss what worked for them and what didn't work. And it's interesting because the one big commonality all of these videos share, including mine, is the fact that most all of them use Anki in one shape, way, or form, because they need some way to retain the information at a long-term level. And Anki has clearly, time and time again, proven to be the best way to do that.
So my more casual, just looking at people's results using Anki, it looks like people who were doing it seriously were getting about 20 additional points on the step one, just on average versus otherwise. So you might go from a 240 to a 255, 260, 265 versus if you didn't do it. Now that's not like a great measurement, or not like statistically valid, but there actually are papers out there that you can look at that are medical journal published papers. And I was just re-looking through your stuff yesterday and today, and I saw on one of your main videos, you have a link to one of those.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is very real literature showing how good Anki is, but it's not necessarily Anki, it's the process that Anki employs, which is spaced repetition, right? So, but the problem is Anki is the only real thing right now out there that employs this so well. But in general, if you could find some way to do spaced repetition, and let me define what spaced repetition is. Spaced repetition is basically, let's say you and I discuss right now a concept, I don't know, like mitochondria is where beta oxidation happens. If that concept is something we discuss right now, you'll remember it maybe for the next 24 hours. But if I don't ask you that again tomorrow, then chances are in a week, you're not going to remember it. So you need to be hit with that same concept tomorrow, and then maybe in 3 days, and then maybe in 5 days. And by being hit with that concept repeatedly over time and space, you will be able to retain that concept over a significantly longer period of time than if you just tried to learn it and then hope that you would remember it for the test in 2 months. And so that's what Anki employs. And if you do some aspect of spaced repetition, the literature scientifically has shown you will do significantly better on your tests, significantly better. And that's like statistically significant in a scientific sense, not just based on anecdotes, even though anecdotal evidence for this has also been through the roof. So that's actually kind of the biggest selling point of this, which is it's not just, oh my God, this works for everyone. This works because it's rooted in science. It works because by visiting things over time, you're actually moving information from short-term memory, which is in your hippocampus, to long-term memory, which is in your cortex. And you can actually facilitate this process and make it go faster by using Anki, and as opposed to existing learning methods like reading books, taking notes, watching videos. All of those may work, but Anki clearly has shown to improve long-term retention because it makes this transfer from this short-term memory to long-term memory much more possible.
Another important keyword there is active recall, where the flashcard really forces you to recall that information. Whereas if you're just reviewing notes, and a lot of people will go through the textbook, they'll take notes, then they'll review their notes over and over again, and they'll feel like it's a little bit better each time, but it's not, it doesn't have the same impact. And when you do Anki and you have that experience of your brain is forced to go look for it, and that really does build those connections. Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. Active learning and passive learning are probably very similar to what we just talked about, but it's a different perspective. So I don't know if you've ever done this, but I have found myself watching a video and then I'll take notes on the side. And I have sometimes caught myself just literally passively copying and writing down exactly what the narrator is saying in the video. That is passive learning because I'm not thinking about anything, right? Sometimes they might just even say a sentence and I'll just blindly write it down. And then I won't even think about it. Like, does this concept make sense to me, what this person just said? I never even fact check myself, right? Because that's passive learning. You're so used to just, oh, this is something he said, or this is something I read, and therefore it must be true. And me rewriting it down will substantiate this information in my head, right? That's the way we've brought up. That's how elementary school worked. That's how middle school works. So we assume that that's how learning works. When in reality, it's actually a horrible way to learn, right?
Yep.
Like, as I said, I was writing something down the other day and I was like, I don't even know what this sentence means, but I just wrote it down because I heard it. And that's all passive because you're not understanding anything, but your brain's like, I'll just write it down because it makes me feel good and I feel like I'm learning something.
That reminds me of, I took a screenshot of one of your videos, and this is one of the things that I picked up from your videos as like a very important tactic. It's your 4 elements, and maybe there's a 5th one or a 6th one I'm missing here, but it's you give like a template of the ideal card, and it's short question, short answer, funky mnemonic, and then relevant background. And so you have this thing of making sure there's context, background information, take a screenshot of the slide where it came out of, put that underneath as like a note or an extra. And I find that to be very valuable. And it really adds, it brings back, you're not just activating that one very targeted neuron, you're sort of reactivating all the little umbrella around it or all the neighboring neurons. And so that seems to do something to bring it back and connect things better.
Yeah, you want to connect because, as I said, the tests like USMLE or any medical test, they're never going to just ask you a regurgitation information question. They're never just going to ask you what's the treatment for this disease. So they will somehow make you implicitly, first of all, recognize what disease is this, and then they'll make you do 2 levels of jumping after that. So you'll not only need to know the disease and the treatment, but sometimes they'll ask you, what drug would you not give this patient? So you need to know what's the disease, what drug is indicated for it, and what drug is therefore contraindicated for it, right? And so because of that, you need to know where information in a flashcard sits in context to the disease. You may know like hemochromatosis is because of the mutation in this HFE gene. But if you don't understand how that HFE gene leads to increased iron overload in the body, then that's a useless piece of information. And so that's why when I'm making these flashcards with active recall, you need to have the question and the answer, but also the broader context of where does that answer lie? How does that answer exactly fit into the overall situation?
And I think that's what's so impressive, and what really impressed me about Anki and this whole thing within the medical school community is that a lot of people think, oh, well, flashcards are just very basic factoid information. You could never use it to learn very important, in-depth, interconnected information. But that's exactly what you need to do for the USMLE step 2. Like, they'll give you a vignette of a specific patient. They'll give you a bunch of facts. They'll sometimes put in like a sort of a tricky piece to it. And then you have to go through the whole analysis of like, okay, what possible things could be going on here? And then is there an exception to the rule? So there is very complex analysis that you have to do with this knowledge that you're memorizing with Anki. And so can you just talk about like how it's really not about factoids and just about learning vocab? This is like a complete, from the most concrete to the most abstract information, all of it is put into Anki and into flashcards, and it really does work.
Yeah, so I totally agree with you that that basic information is never asked on the USMLE, but the problem is you need to know it.
Yeah.
like the back of your hand, right? You will never be asked like, what is this disease? But you need to know every single disease so well that when that disease does come up, you not only know how to identify it, you also know its treatments. So the USMLE is an aggregation, and I'd say most tests, most difficult tests, are an aggregation of very fundamental knowledge that you should have down cold, like the back of your hand, but in an applied fashion, right? And the problem is you can't ever get to the application side of a question if you don't have the facts down cold,
Yeah.
right? There will never be a time when you'll know the treatment for hemochromatosis if you don't know what hemochromatosis is, right? And so in that regard, Anki does still help with that basic level of regurgitation factoid information. And so that argument of like, oh, flashcards are just factoid informations. Well, yeah, it is, but you need to know that factoid information really, really well. So that does work. But on top of that, you can also then use that information to create additional flashcards. So I do agree with you there too, where once you have all these factoids, now your foundation is complete. You've built the base of this pyramid of application. Now you can move on to next level questions, right? So now you're not just asking what is hemochromatosis. You can now ask what is the underlying pathophysiology of hemochromatosis? What exactly is going on? And after you have that down, then you say, how do the treatments of hemochromatosis relate to the underlying pathophysiology, right? And then after you have that down, now you can really, so each level requires you to have a sound foundation of the level before it. And because of that, Anki allows you to build that initial foundational level really strong. And once you've had that strong level, you can then move up. And as you move up, you can slowly start seeing where the questions come in and how to fix yourself as you're doing that.
Let me ask you if this is a good sort of very basic summary for people that aren't familiar with some of this terminology. It seems like pre-med is learning at more the microscopic level, at the chemical and biochemical level of like the individual molecules and cells and stuff like that. Then you get into med school and you learn your anatomy, which is like a static, mostly static picture of how the body is, all the different systems. Then you get into physiology, where it's more the process of how do each of these systems, it's sort of like looking at a car that's not turned on versus looking at a car that's turned on and running all its machinery. And then you get into the treatment, where it's like, okay, how can something go wrong with that car? And then how you diagnose it based on understanding both the structure of it and the various processes and mechanisms. And
Yes.
then once you understand those, you have the treatment that then interacts with your the various labels you put on the different problems or diagnoses.
Yeah, that's actually phenomenal. That's a great summary. It starts with the basics, and it starts in undergrad, which is very, very, very basic. And I don't think you ever even hit on any medicine. You just hit on the principles of science. You hit on basic chemical laws, physical laws, biological laws that govern the functioning of the human body in our world. But in medical school, yeah, you're right. Then you hit the anatomy and the physiology, which is structure and function respectively. And then you hit the pathophysiology, which is how can that structure and function go wrong? And then you ultimately end with treatment, which is, okay, this is what's the issue. What do we have here that can help?
And so the flashcards exist at all of those levels. And so you see the abstraction going up and down, where the flashcards really do allow you at each stage, at the higher or lower levels, all those later flashcards that come later on in the process, those all build on the factoids you learn earlier in the process.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm curious what you're thinking about actually, I want to spend a little bit more time on med school and then go into the MBA, MD, and a couple other things. But I want to just give people a sense of the level of rigor and the level of time that you're putting in, because when I first saw what medical students are doing in those first 2 years and beyond, I didn't even think that was possible. It was really opened up my eyes to, like, I didn't think that the human body could, or the human brain could do that. And it really caused me to up my own standards. So I think it reminded me again, that sort of Navy SEAL Hell Week. This is like 2+ years of Hell Week, just like getting all this information. So I like it if you could talk about, how many hours a day you're putting into Anki during those first 2 years, how much time you're putting into watching lectures, and then also just reading textbooks, to give people an idea of the quantitatively the amount of time that you're putting in.
Yeah. I can speak objectively for med school first, and then I can speak a bit more about Yale, because Yale's definitely different.
Yeah.
But most med schools will have lectures for at least 6 hours a day. So you start at maybe 8 and go until maybe 1 or 2. And each lecture is about an hour long. And so you have 6 of them. And then after that, you're literally going to be studying for the rest of the day, right? Like, I don't understand. If you had 6 hours of lectures, it probably takes at least 4 hours to review all of that, if
Right.
not more than 4. So now you have 10 hours of your day just spent studying or some form of studying. And then assuming you reviewed it, you're going to have an accumulation of information every day, right? So that 4 hours, it may just take you 4 hours initially on day one, but as you move on with the rest of your week, it's going to take consequently more and more time. So I would say, like, in my first 2 years, most medical students will end up doing at least 10 hours of work a day. And then that includes weekends, because I think they use the 10 hours on weekends to also catch up on everything during the week. And I don't know how to put a tangible number on this, but let's just say that in undergrad, for anyone who goes to an undergrad institution, let's say you take an undergrad science course. If you imagine the amount of material covered in one semester of an undergrad science course, that is covered in about a week and a half in medical school. And so that just kind of puts things into perspective, because I remember for biochemistry, we spent a week on biochemistry, and it covered as much, if not more, material than what I had covered in my one semester biochemistry course at UC Berkeley. So that's kind of the rigor that they're going at. They don't really slow down. And if you think about it, even in undergrad, you would have maybe 3 lectures a week for a certain course. And in medical schools, you have 6 lectures a day, right? So that ends up kind of showing you again just how much there is. In terms of my personal experience, Yale doesn't have as many requirements. So we don't have like mandatory lectures. We don't have mandatory things we have to do as much. So what I was doing is actually learning a lot of these things on my own. I was podcasting the lectures, kind of going through them more quickly. But you're right. Most of my personal time was spent on Anki, where I'd be making my own flashcards and then doing them, as opposed to watching a lot more lectures, which, as we just discussed, the reason I'm not as big of a fan is 6 hours of my time is not going to be best spent watching lectures.
Right.
If anything, going through those lectures maybe relatively quickly, kind of getting the bare bones foundation, but I should be spending most of that time actively learning, whether that's in the form of making my flashcards, doing my flashcards, understanding concepts, really hitting videos, specific videos that address the concepts that I'm confused with, not just very broad concepts. And so for me, I'd say I would do maybe 3-4 hours of review, passive learning a day, and then 3 to 4 hours of active learning a day in the form of Anki flashcards, making flashcards, and doing flashcards.
Okay, I want to ask just a few micro questions on a few different pieces there. So one is you mentioned 3 to 4 hours of review. Let's say we're in a standard med school. Is that you took notes during the lecture? Like most students, are they going to lecture or streaming it and then they're taking notes, or they have PowerPoint slides? Like or are they creating flashcards? Like what did that review look like for you? And also what does it look like for, let's say, the average med student who is aware of Anki and has Anki as a core part of their strategy?
So I think for most students who have Anki as a core part of their strategy, either that passive learning is in the form of watch the lectures first and take bare bones handwritten notes on it and then convert those into flashcards. Or the way I did it was I would be watching the lecture on one half of my screen and Anki would be pulled up on the other half. And I would just be taking screenshots from the screen itself and putting them into my Anki cards to hit concepts home, or I'd be making flashcards related to certain concepts they pointed out.
And you're watching live, or are these recordings?
Oh, I was watching the recordings. You're right.
Okay.
Yeah. So a lot of people who go to lectures in medical school may do a first pass of just writing the notes while they're watching the lectures. But I personally was watching the lectures at home, where I'd have the lecture pulled up on one half of my screen and the flashcards being made on the other half.
And one of the interesting optimization problems that maybe I think you talked about Yale is different because of the pass-fail component, but a lot of students are optimizing between getting good grades in their class versus doing high yield stuff where there's certain professors that will teach a lot of stuff that isn't going to be on the step one test. And so it's sort of, you learn it short term to take the test for the class, but then you forget it most of the time because it's not going to be on the step one. So what was your strategy on that? And what do you recommend people do when they do have to get a grade?
Yeah, I think it's definitely, you have to balance both. If you're getting a grade for a class, optimize that grade, right? I think that is definitely the best way to go, because if you're trying to optimize one thing, you should try to optimize whatever it is that's in the short term, because you can't necessarily control the long term. Like, you could say, I'm studying for step one, so screw all my grades now. Well, you don't necessarily control how well you're going to do on step one if, like, you don't do well in your classes, right? So focus on, if you're getting grades on your classes, try to do the best you can there. And then when step one comes around, the fact that you try to do your best in those classes still has a lot of merit, right? We like to say, like, oh, maybe they're not completely overlap. Maybe doing well in your classes is not entirely the same as doing well in the step one, which is 100% true. But I do think that people who tend to do well in their classes, I would be very surprised if they did not do well on step one. Because that means that if you did well in your classes, you perfected your Anki technique, or you perfected how you make flashcards, you perfected what works, what doesn't work. And then when step one came around, you already had a good fund of knowledge, and that techniques that you used to do well in your classes, you can now just apply to step one. It's not too difficult. As opposed to people who just study purely for step one, I feel like they often get caught up in trying to learn just basic stuff that they think is useful for the test. And that kind of deprives them of learning basic stuff that's useful for normal, real medicine and real patient lives. And so I've always kind of been an advocate of, like, whatever's in front of you, try to do the best at it possible, and you'll get a lot more out of it. And then use those skills to then do better on step one and those big tests that are coming.
I think another misconception or preconception a lot of people think with flashcards, and I hear it quite a bit even within a lot of people in the Anki community, is not using pre-made decks. And the funny thing about med school is that you have these pre-made decks that are very popular and people use them. You've talked about how you've used them. And so can you talk about why they work? Because a lot of people will say, oh, well, you need to take your own notes. You can't use somebody else's notes or somebody else's flashcards. So there is a grain of truth to that, but can you explain the variables there and how you've handled it?
Yeah, so pre-made decks work. I do agree with that. But I think they only work if, as we just discussed, you have the full picture behind the concept, right? So if there's a flashcard and you just do the flashcard blindly thinking, oh, this isn't a pre-made deck, this is something I need to know, and you just try to blindly rote memorize that information, that is useless. That is 100% the stupidest way to study, because what that means is you are memorizing someone else's mind. And that's not a good way to do it, because you don't have the context of their mind, you don't have the background of their mind, you don't know what they were thinking when they made that card. But if you then learn the background information behind that card, and you were able to understand, oh, I know why this card is the way it is, I know why the answer is what it is, and you filled in, the extra column in Anki with your own personal notes, or you kind of gave yourself the tutoring you needed to contextualize that card, then by all means use the pre-made deck. Because the reason the pre-made decks work is because they've been validated. They have actually been made by people who did really well on the exam, on the step one exam. So clearly, if you can learn everything in this deck, you too will probably do really well. But learning is not the same as blindly memorizing. Because if someone blindly memorized all 20,000 cards in a pre-made deck, they will still probably fail the USMLE. But if you were able to still learn those 20,000 cards with the same context and same background, with the intent that the creator had made that deck in the first place, then yeah, you're going to do great. And so that's the whole reason why pre-made decks are such a red flag sometimes. People need to use them well, because you need to use them as the owner intended, not just, I'm going to memorize all of this because I know it's a foolproof strategy, because rote memorization will not get you anywhere.
It does save a lot of
time.
time.
It'll get you the foundation, but it won't get you past that level that we were talking about, which is you really need to know the background for a lot of these things.
The advantage for people that are not familiar with this stuff is that pre-made cards save you a huge amount of time. They probably cut your time in creating flashcards in half, or like 75% reduction. So it's a huge advantage to use them if you can use them, but you have to use them right. And I want to do some rapid fire questions. And a lot of this is just, these are the biggest lessons that I got from you. So, if there's any quick things you want to add, but these are just like the top things that I got from you. So another thing I noticed is that you use a lot of decks. Like a lot of people say, oh, you can't have more than like 10 or 20 decks or will slow down to a crawl. And I have dozens, if not probably 100 or more decks and sub decks. And I don't notice a significant performance decline. So can you, cause I've seen yours on the screen share and it's really, you've got quite a bit of decks. And so I assume it's not causing many issues.
Yeah, so the reason I have a lot of decks is one, I use Anki as my entire database of knowledge.
Yeah.
And then what I'll do is if I'm studying for a specific thing, I will create a deck specifically for that one thing. So let's say I'm studying nephrology, then I'll create a deck for nephrology. And then the reason I have so many other decks is because that is my database of information that I've ever accumulated throughout all of medicine.
Yep.
Right. So now as I'm going through nephrology, oh, hey, I want to learn about nephrotic syndrome. I'll just look up nephrotic syndrome in that database of information, see all the cards that are related, and I'll be like, oh, I made some of these cards. I remember some of it. And I'll bring them into that deck that I'm currently studying. And so the whole reason I have so many decks is primarily because most of the time my emphasis is still usually concentrated on one deck, but all those other decks are a source from which I abstract the knowledge that I need for that specific test. So right now I'm studying for step 2, and you'll know that step 2 is really dense. So what I did was I created a step 2 deck, but I pulled other cards from all my other decks into that step 2 deck. So as I cover more and more concepts, my step 2 deck becomes more and more heavy. But the reason why it becomes more and more heavy is because I'm extracting things from my other decks that are going into my step 2 deck. And even within my step 2 deck, I'll create a lot of sub decks. And again, the point of that is just to organize things in my head, because when you're trying to memorize 20,000 cards, it's much easier to memorize them in 20 brinks of 100, as opposed to one brink of 20,000, right? And so that's the other reasoning I have there. And as you mentioned, it hasn't affected my ability to retain material at all.
What is your perspective on close deletion versus normal question answer format?
I get this question a lot, surprisingly, and I think I'm going to make a video on it. But I just think closed deletion is much more flexible, right? So if you were to memorize like 3 different things and you want to memorize them in sequence, closed deletion helps you like 1, 2, 3. Got it. Or if you wanted to create just a simple sentence and blurb out one word from that sentence, a closed deletion helps you do that more, as opposed to a front and back. If you wanted to blur out a word from a sentence, you'd actually have to like draw a line, right? It just takes a bit more time. And I think part of it is also just, I use closed deletions pretty early on. And so I just kind of stuck to them because it's so easy to make a closed deletion, as opposed to front and back was just something I hadn't gotten accustomed to.
Okay. What do you think about pre-learning? Like, do you think there's medical school students or more general, if you even broaden it out to law school or something else where you have to learn a sort of defined amount of stuff in a certain amount of time, what would happen if somebody learned, over the summer before their first year because they're worried, like, I'm not going to be able to get through all the biochem in a week?
I mean, the problem is, I totally agree that there may be a lot of pre-learning happening, but eventually it'll catch up to you. Like the pacing will catch up to you, right? Like you're not going to be able to pre-learn all of the first year of medical school in your summer. And so while I do think it's important to kind of brush up on things that you're loose about and you're not as confident about, pre-learning entire sets of knowledge is just going to put you a leg down when you have to get used to the pace. And so other students will have to get used to the pace starting day 1 because they would not have pre-learned anything. And you may have. So you will be like, cool, I'm chilling. But then the moment maybe, the cardiology block comes around, now things have caught up to you and you have to now jump into that. Oh, I have to start still learning all of this stuff really fast. So I guess pre-learning will definitely give you an advantage early on and maybe give you a bit more time to get adjusted to medical school, but it won't change the fact that eventually you will have to get used to running way faster than you've ever run before. And that realization is going to come sooner or later.
That reminds me of one other thing with the daily standards is, can you tell people just like, you're doing hundreds of flashcards per day and you're doing like, how many are you doing per hour? Just like those basic numbers.
So right now I'm optimizing a bit more for speed because I'm studying for a test. So I go a bit faster.
Mhm.
I usually learn in different ways. If I'm optimizing for content sometimes and time is not an issue, like when the coronavirus pandemic hit in January, I really wanted to learn about it. And
Yeah.
so when I was doing flashcards there, I would do maybe 300 an hour because their quality was way more important than quantity because I really wanted to understand these concepts. So with each flashcard, I'd look at it. I'd be like, oh, I remember this. What's the concept here? Got it. Move on. But right now, because I'm going for speed, because in medicine, speed actually is important. A lot of people are like, you should always learn for quality, not quantity. And that's actually completely false. In medicine, it's really important to know a lot about everything, right? And not necessarily why everything works, but you still need to know a lot about everything. So speed is a big factor. And so right now I'm going a lot more for making sure I have an understanding broadly of everything before I go deeper. So right now I can do pretty much like 500-600 cards an hour, is my current pace. And that's what I'm working on right now.
So one of the things we're not going to have time to get to today is all the add-ons that you recommend and you use for Anki. But some of the things you've talked about, you're using plugins to achieve those, to like time cards or to create. There's different things that you do. So I recommend people check out your YouTube channel for all the different plugins you use. I want to. We're getting to the end of the podcast here, so I want to quickly talk about the MBA and just you have a video on your YouTube, so people can watch that for all the details. But I'm curious, just how are you going to apply the learning strategies from medical school to the MBA, and then beyond that, you've been in this pressure cooker where you have to use Anki. But what happens after medical school? I mean, MBA is not going to have the same, anywhere close to the same level, I assume, of medical school. So what's going to happen with Anki and with your learning system once you get into the MBA phase? And then what's going to happen after the MBA in terms of how are you going to approach lifelong learning?
Those are great questions to end on. I really like them. And I don't anticipate using Anki in my MBA, to be honest with you. I don't see any real need for rote memorization or foundational memorization. It seems like, if anything, MBA may involve a bit more math, which you don't need to memorize a lot of things for because it's so conceptual. But if and when the time comes in my MBA that I need to understand concrete fundamental principles or terminology in business, that's for sure a time I would pull out Anki and just get the terms in and the understanding of fundamental concepts. So I think I'll definitely take a bit of a hiatus from Anki, at least in business school, primarily because I want to focus a lot more on entrepreneurship, maybe exploring, ideas and really understanding how to get things moving in a very practical sense. But in terms of lifelong learning, I don't anticipate ever stopping to use Anki. Like, I really don't. I think I will always use Anki for the rest of my life because it's such a good tool. And it's so cool because it's all on your phone now too. Like, I have my Anki app on my phone, which means all of the medical knowledge that I have ever accrued from day one of medical school is going to be on my phone for the rest of my life. And that's really cool because now let's say I want to look up a concept. Like, let's say I'm in the OR and someone goes into malignant hyperthermia. I can easily look it up. Not that I would ever look it up in the OR, but I can easily look it up right away, right? It's in my fingertips. So I can look through my cards and be like, what is malignant hyperthermia? Oh my God, I remember this. Oh, it's that one lecture in medical school, because all of my flashcards will have the specific lecture attached and maybe slides and stuff. So it's such a cool way that I find myself doing that even today, where I'm in the hospital and I'll be like, oh, I totally forgot this concept. What was it again? And I just look it up on my Anki, and it takes 30 seconds for me to refresh my mind. And then I'll maybe even go home that day and make more cards about it. And right now I have cards about the COVID-19 pandemic. So now let's say someone in the future refers to coronavirus pandemic. I have all the research that I did about coronavirus on my Anki too. So it's literally an e-device for my brain's information that has ever existed in my brain since medical school started. And so the good part is I really want to make sure I can use that moving forward and add to it as I accrue more information.
So you don't use OneNote or Evernote or Notion or anything. You just, everything goes into Anki.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. I don't think since medical school started, I took some notes on notepads when I was reviewing for tests, but most of my notes right now go straight into Anki.
Do you
Just
use anything like that outside of notes though, for just like keeping financial stuff organized or like just for non-learning stuff?
Oh yeah, yeah. So I'll have Excel sheets and Excel sheets for a lot of financial stuff and logistical stuff. But in terms of knowledge and note taking, I don't think I use anything else except for Anki.
Yeah, I think I got that from your channel also, is that there's people that literally don't take notes. They just go directly from the video they're watching and just bang out flashcards. And I'd never heard of somebody doing that before, and apparently it works very well.
Well, yeah. So what I'll do is I'll actually take notes in the extra column of my Anki. So I actually have a video coming out on this soon, so you'll really appreciate it. But I basically make the whole lecture. I take all of the notes that I would take in a Word document on the extra column in Anki, and then I freeze that extra column. And then basically I use that extra column to make questions from.
Wow.
And so because of that, my notes are all there. The notes will never go away. So it's not like I'm not taking any notes. The notes that I would have taken on a Microsoft Word document are in the extra column, and they're all there. And I organize them the same way I would in Microsoft Word. But then what I do is, because I freeze that extra column, I can then make flashcards directly from those notes. And I don't have to go through that intermediate of a paper note and then communicating that into Anki. Everything is just already on Anki.
So what you're saying with just for people that don't know what extra column means, basically it's one of the boxes. You have like the front of the card, the back of the card, and then extra is like a third box, third side of the card that will show up when you flip the note card over. So what he's doing is adding, like, you're taking a page or two of notes, or maybe three, and then you're attaching that page to every single flashcard within Anki, and then you're just extracting each factoid, creating a different card. But each of those cards is linked to that, let's say 1 to 3 pages of notes.
Yes, but it's not necessarily 1 to 3 pages. I will separate my notes based on concepts. So even in one lecture, they'll have distinct transitions. So maybe we're talking about focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, and then we move on to HIV nephropathy. Well, when we move on to HIV nephropathy, I'll delete all of my notes from FSGS, focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, and then just have notes on HIV nephropathy. So each of those notes won't actually be even a page or two. It'll still be like, I'd say maybe 1 paragraph, maybe 2, but all in bullet point format. And then above those notes, I create a very discrete horizontal line. And then I add the part of the note right at the top to make it relevant to the card that I'm making. But the whole point of this is at this point, I have come to eliminate the intermediate of taking paper notes or handwritten notes or even Microsoft Word notes. All of my notes go straight into Anki, because what I've realized is, am I ever going to refer back to my paper notes or my Microsoft Word notes? I don't think I remember a single time when I've actually looked things up and tried to find a specific Word document that I wrote notes on,
Right. Yeah.
at least not in the future. But with Anki now, I actually have found myself looking thousands of times back at notes that I've actually referenced. And I'm like, whoa, I'm using Anki way more than I've ever used any of my real notes in the past. So why would I ever make those notes? If I just make notes here, I could benefit so much more from them.
Yeah. So
that's what I've been working on the last few months. And it's.
Sorry, I had a little bit of a Wi-Fi breakup or something. Can you just repeat the last sentence or two?
Yeah. So as I said, I just have never found myself looking at my notes anymore in terms of my written notes or a Microsoft Word document, but I have found myself going to my Anki notes a lot. I found myself looking up Anki cards a lot. I found myself looking up things on Anki way more. So what that prompted me to say was, why am I even taking paper notes if I'm never going to really reference them? Aside from maybe now, let's say in the future, 10 years from now, am I ever going to really be able to come back to my paper notes? No, there's no way. What about a Microsoft Word document? No, there's no way. But what about an Anki card? Well, yeah, all of Anki is in one place. It's easily accessible by phone, by iPad, by my computer. So why would I not just take all of my notes there and have my information stored away in a secure fashion that's easily accessible? And that's kind of why I've started doing what I've been doing.
Yeah, so I recommend everybody check out Prerak's YouTube channel. There's a lot of stuff there, and that's where I learned a lot of what I know with Anki. So there's a lot of stuff about Anki add-ons, just getting started, the very basics. I highly recommend you check that out. And you also have a podcast called Red, White, and Brown. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is something outside of medicine. But as an Indian American, I feel like there wasn't much out there that kind of discuss the experiences and what it means to be a first generation immigrant in the United States. So this podcast is primarily for anyone who's a first generation immigrant and talking about the experiences you go through trying to balance, your identity as someone who comes from another country, but also your identity of being raised in the US and having to balance those two things. It's actually a great getaway from medicine when I'm not doing medicine, which I'm doing most of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Yes, everybody check that out. That's Red, White, and Brown. And also check out his YouTube podcast, Prerak Juthani, on YouTube.
Perfect.
So Prerak, thanks a lot for coming on. And we'll be excited to see what happens next in your journey with the MBA and everything else on your YouTube channel. So thanks again for coming on.
Of course. Thank you.